I think everything in medicine gets adopted so slowly.
I think we're in a really interesting time where the science is really outpacing the care that's delivered at the bedside.
Not all technology is made the same, and even the same technology improves throughout time. So if you've seen something, even if you're skeptical, give it a try, see what actual results it produces. And even if the results aren't good, go back and revisit it.
There are so many things that we can do today that were not even fathomable 10 years ago.
We're cutting hospitalizations up to 50%. We're keeping patients on treatment longer, again, up to 50%.
Why hasn't there been a more revered uptake of some of these mechanisms to improve outcomes? What does it take to build technology that oncology practices will actually use and trust? The answer sounds simple, but I know from my own personal experience, it's incredibly hard. The product has to be useful enough to actually change how clinicians work. Today, I'm joined by somebody who's been wrestling with that same challenge, but from a different angle. Lavi Kwiatkowsky, the founder and CEO of Canopy. Canopy is an AI platform built for care that happens between oncology visits. Think remote patient monitoring, AI-powered call management, and the infrastructure that practices need to keep patients safe when they're not in the clinic. Lavi and I have been building in oncology in parallel for nearly a decade. We both came to healthcare through our own personal experiences, and we both chose oncology because the stakes are so incredibly high and so incredibly important. In this conversation, we compare notes on why oncology practices can be slow to adopt even well-validated tools. We talk about where point solutions break down, what oncology-specific tech stacks really look like, and what change management really requires, especially when you're trying to turn a skeptical physician into an advocate. If you've been listening for a while, this episode comes from a slightly different angle. I hope you enjoy the conversation, and as always, be sure to subscribe. I would love for you to kind of share kind of your journey, how you became an entrepreneur, and what ultimately led you to starting Canopy.
So engineer by background, was working in tech, and I had a bad accident, pretty bad. And I had to get a couple of surgeries with open fractures and very unpleasant things. And one of the surgeries had a complication, and basically I had an infection. And when I went home after the surgery, it wasn't caught, and there was no monitoring process. And so by the time it was identified, it had been too late, and I had to get multiple repeat surgeries to fix it, which sucks. It absolutely sucks, right? One of those times I had been inpatient late at night, going through excruciating pain. Some of our viewers might relate with this. It was sort of early on first seasons of Game of Thrones. It was like maybe season 3 or 4. And I remember, like, this is my favorite show, right? And I remember the first 5 minutes felt like 2 hours. I just couldn't get through it. I was just so much pain, and I couldn't sleep. And I ring the nurse button, and just no one comes for a couple hours at least. And for me, like, minutes are passing like hours, right? So I was just crushing pain. And eventually the nurse showed up, and she was so apologetic, and she was so nice and so kind. And she said that there's a protocol where she has to go through every single room and chart a bunch of stuff and everyone's vitals and all kinds of other data points before she's allowed back to her station to continue helping patients and do her regular course of work. And that really stuck with me, because that felt like something that was so, susceptible to automation. Like the fact that the nurse is focused on documentation, which has value, of course, but focused on documentation over care, that sort of hit me so hard in that moment where I was literally suffering of pain. And, she didn't know. How would she know? She was, going between the rooms. I wasn't screaming and shouting. I was just suffering. I think there's a lot in common with that and people that undergo cancer, treatment and the journey. But just to wrap us up on this story, while I was going through that, I just sort of felt like working on online marketing or sales or any other, tech. And most of the tech jobs ends up with selling some product to some person, right? And I just really felt compelled to do something in healthcare. And as this was happening, I lost a few family members to cancer. And the same sort of gaps that I had seen in my orthopedic journey, let's say, and with the infections and with the pain, the same things happened, the same sort of systemic, or I'd say process failures, lack of technology, some of which could be solved by technology. The same happened in cancer care, but just there, it meant life and death. And that was so much more compelling to me. Like, if you could solve a problem, do you want to shorten someone's orthopedic hospital stay or help with their pain? Or do you want to save a life or really help someone who's truly suffering? And to me, that was, very attractive to work on those problems.
Thank you for sharing your story. And I think a lot of us that work in healthcare, coming from all these different backgrounds, have similar stories in the sense that there's nothing more impactful that you can do, in my opinion, than to be working in healthcare, because literally these decisions are life or death. And, both you and I have kind of seen, not only firsthand what happens when things go wrong, but also firsthand, what happens when things go right and when you fix them. I'd love for you to share a little bit more about, what Canopy does specifically today. And, how do you think that changes the way that cancer care is being delivered? What are some of kind of the impacts that you guys are making in the community today? And also, where do you see these, the technology going?
Canopy is the leader in enterprise AI for oncology. What that means for us is basically creating enterprise-grade tools for all the care that happens between visits, and especially when it touches patient services. So, for example, you need a system to answer the phone. You need a way to monitor your patients between visits. You need a way to remind them about their appointments or to register them up front. And there's basically a tremendous amount of care that happens between visits because, 99%, 95% of the time, the patient's not in the office. And so we solve for these problems. At the core of our platform are what we call our treatment management vertical, which is how do we keep patients safe between visits? How do we check in with them, find any symptoms or issues they might be having? How do we, triage these effectively, surface the most urgent ones to the very top? And how do we support the nursing care teams in effectively resolving those so that patients do better? And half of patients will have severe toxicity from their treatment. Majority of them will have ER visits and hospitalizations. A lot of those are avoidable, but there's even a bigger story here of if you can catch these things while they're small, if you could sort of catch them when they're mild, not when they're severe, typically what happens is also the patients do better. They feel better. They don't have to stop treatment prematurely, and they have better outcomes overall. And that's what we've seen in clinical trials like Ethan Bash. He had this seminal trial that was a plenary session at ASCO that sort of very much inspired me to do this specific thing, remote monitoring cancer. And we've published so much since then. We've had ASCO orals, one oral coming up this year. An oral we just presented in ASH, we're basically showing look, we're cutting hospitalizations up to 50%. We're keeping patients on treatment longer. Again, up to 50%. And it sort of makes complete sense. You catch these symptoms of infection early, give them antibiotics in the outpatient. They don't need to get hospitalized with a severe infection that could kill them. And Matt, the new treatments that we're seeing are so much more complicated, so much more toxic in some ways, on the whole. But let's say when you talk about bispecifics, some long-term outcomes are coming out from studies around the world showing up to 10, 15% mortality rates due to infections. And that's huge. If we can do anything about that, that makes me happy to show up to work in the morning.
It's really interesting. We have a lot of people on this podcast, and, we spend a lot of time talking about how do you innovate at the point of care. And, we had, some conversations on this podcast where it's like, look, it's not just about innovating at the point of care, but it's like, how do you actually think about the patient experience more holistically, and where are opportunities that, we can apply technology, AI, or even just human services to improve not just the experience, but also the outcomes for the patients. And I think the angle that Canopy is going at it is really awesome and unique. And the fact that you're seeing kind of the impact that you're making, not only on saving time for the enterprise and the business of oncology, but also the impact that you're making on patients. It's just really awesome to see, and I really grateful to have developed this friendship over the past few years, building oncology companies
Don't
together.
oversell it, man. People are listening,
Yeah, we secretly hate each other, but we pretend to be nice when we're in front of the camera. But anyways, I think one of the things that you said was a really interesting thing where I think the oncology community, with the kind of advent of precision medicine and new types of therapy, a lot of the discourse has really been around like, what are new drugs that are coming to market? What are the outcomes of some of these new kind of biospecific treatments that we're delivering to patients? And there's almost a bias, right, for those types of therapies versus some of the other types of therapies, that may not be rooted in a molecule, but really rooted in the patient experience, that has actually shown, to your point, to actually deliver really meaningful outcomes in terms of improving life expectancy, improving a patient's ability to live through, their disease. I'm wondering, can you comment on that, right? Like, why do you think there's that bias today in the community, and why hasn't there been a more kind of revered uptake of some of these other, mechanisms to improve outcomes?
I think everything in medicine gets adopted so slowly. And there's such a high degree of, I wouldn't say necessarily, that physicians are so risk averse, as they are trained to be careful and to be responsible as a whole. And the medical community acts in accordance with that. And then there are different things that happen for a drug. Like, let's even take the example you said, there's a bias against things that are not drugs. And I think that things that are not drugs per se suffer. But let's look at the drug for a second. Drugs take 10 years to reach some of them not even peak adoption. 10 years is so long. And what the drug has going for it from day one are two things. From day one, right, from FDA approval, it has withstood some sort of rigorous evaluation, like the FDA in this example, right? The clinical trials that took 10 years and the FDA, and some rigorous validation approval and a stamp of approval that everyone has come to learn to trust. And then following that, it's reimbursed. And there is basically all the mechanics in the background where the doctor prescribes the drug. And from that moment on, she doesn't need to think about anything. She prescribes the drug, an order's put in, McKesson, Cencora, et cetera. They will distribute the drug to the practice. Contracting is something that, they know how to go through these processes, right? They contract, they will ship the drug, you put in the order, they know how to mix it, everything happens. And I think when we think about software, there isn't necessarily a rigorous process. And then it depends what the software does. If the software automates something that's already been established and you need to do, like I'd say this is maybe closer to what you guys are doing, in the past that were human scribes. You guys are doing the job, but I think it's not so much displacing those human scribes as much as it didn't scale. And then some people had scribes offshore. Maybe you can talk about this, much better than I do. But I'd say once you got to some level of quality, it absolutely exploded, right?
Yes.
Right. For you at DeepScribe, there were years of building through it and getting to some level of quality. And then at some point it hit in a way that the practice were saying, okay, the quality of this is game changing. I think with remote monitoring, it's similar in the sense that we're not automating something we're doing. Well, one of our products is remote monitoring, right? But when you think about that, we're doing an intervention. And when doctors see interventions, if it was a clinical trial, they say yes, but that doesn't generalize to my patients in rural insert state, right? Rural Oklahoma, rural Texas, rural whatever, right? And if it's real evidence, they say, yeah, but it wasn't rigorous, because it's hard to believe these new data that are so, in my opinion, sometimes hard to buy. Like in the original trial, Ethan Bash showed in metastatic patients, and a 20% increase in overall survival. That's insane. That's like some immunotherapy drug in some of its best indications. And so they're right to be skeptical. And over time, we've developed, I think, a body of evidence. We could call it a small body of evidence now, 13 peer-reviewed publications and presentations and scientific meetings. But over time, also what happens is you have your customers who have seen success stories, who have seen a patient whose life was changed. We've had that nurse come to them and tell them a success story. We've had a patient tell them a success story. And I think, the more practices join Canopy, implement what we do, change how they care for their patients between visits, and become sort of champions, the more we see that happening. It hasn't been 10 years for us yet. But certainly an intervention that changes how medicine is practiced is much, much harder. Sorry, for everyone, the neighbor's grass is greener. So when I look at you, I'm like, okay, he's not changing the way they work. He's helping them do what they always wanted to do. And I think with remote monitoring, there's also an added hurdle of it's not like every patient left the office and after every visit got a phone call and now we're automating that. The phone calls were only added recently because of an acknowledgement of the medical community that chemotherapy is dangerous, as a name for systemic therapy writ large, right? These drugs are dangerous. We should check in with patients. And so nurses call patients after the first cycle of chemotherapy, immunotherapy, whatever drug they're getting. And that's part of the ASCO quality standard. But the thing is, these calls are so, it's labor. It's manual. You have to pick up the phone, call the patient. They don't pick up. They call you back. You call them. And who's to say that exactly in those 10 minutes that you're speaking with them, they're already experiencing the problem. They're already having the issue. And so there's a difference between, calling someone after their first cycle and being in touch with them throughout the duration of their therapy, which could be a year, could be years, and keeping them safe. And even if they don't report all the time how they're feeling, they know that they have this avenue that they could go to, and then they check in and they get help. And that's all that matters, is when they're really suffering, they have that way to communicate with the practice.
But Lavi, how do you think that gets accelerated, right? You brought up a lot of these kind of systemic issues in the oncology community about why there might be a bias towards drugs. A lot of that could be the fact that, it's a drug and it's, you can charge for it. And maybe the incentive models behind, patient monitoring versus prescribing drugs need to be changed in order to really kind of encourage these other forms of therapy outside of drugs. I'm curious, if you look at kind of the landscape of if you had a magic wand and you could change one thing about, the oncology community, whether it be more evidence, whether it be, the change in reimbursement, whatever it is, what would you say would be kind of the single most thing that would kind of accelerate the adoption of Canopy?
This is interesting. I'd say, look, certainly on remote monitoring, reimbursement would be a game changer. And there is reimbursement, but there isn't any reimbursement that is oncology specific. And I think that an oncologist look at it and some say, this is great and I'll use it. And some say, this is great and I'll use it with this caveat. And some say, well, no one told me that this is specific to oncology. I'm not sure if I want to use it. And also the reimbursement, we have to be honest, it could pay for multiples of Canopy, but it's still not something that's like a game changer that would change your practice. It's a great way to afford Canopy and make back a multiple of Canopy, but it's not something like, the doctors will be increasing their paychecks after that. It's not that form of incentive. So, but certainly reimbursement would help. I think in adopting Canopy, which is sort of like a platform to better care for your patients between visits, and it's more comprehensive than just the remote monitoring. It's how you care for them. There's implementation and there's change management and there's how do we take a bunch of point solutions and turn them into one, and do our nurses practice differently, do their work differently, or is it not much of a hurdle? And so over time, what we've seen is we integrate better with the EMRs, whether it's OncoEMR or iKnowMed and the McKesson ecosystem, Epic and Cerner and others. What we've also seen is as our platform grows beyond the treatment management vertical, then there's more incentive to adopt us because, hey, we can help with your operations. We can help reduce phone calls to the office, help patients message, help answer these calls using AI. Some of them help catch the calls that you can't answer. So patients are just dropping off, hanging up because they're done. They're sick and tired of waiting on hold, which is also a horrible experience, right? And so I think over time we build more products that in and of themselves have value, and then the value of the entire platform compounds and customers become happier, and that whole thing creates a flywheel. And funny enough, like as we go about this, we discover opportunities that we never would have known existed when we first got started, when I started the company, when you're so deep in it. So just to name one example, we always knew that the more drugs are toxic or dangerous or life-saving, then, there would be more incentive to provide the drug earlier, to monitor the patient, to keep them safe. What we never knew was drugs that get adopted so slowly because they are toxic or they have novel toxicities, that Canopy would be able to play a part in this. And we're seeing recently is with bispecifics or CAR T, a lot of practices are coming to us and saying, hey, have you thought about using your system for that? And yeah, absolutely. For years, we've been, for 2-3 years now, really hard at work on this problem. We have this whole sort of initiative around bispecifics, and we've discovered this opportunity to partner with the practices. And, worth mentioning Oncology, who is a big partner of ours in adopting bispecifics. So they have an initiative irrespective of Canopy. And we're honored to be a partner of theirs and being the technology partner to help them lower the barriers for adoption of these therapies by increasing safety, by ensuring the patients will be monitored appropriately without having a nurse call them every 3 hours, by ensuring all the nurses will know how to follow the latest evidence and guidelines because we program it into Canopy's pathways, by helping sort of collect data to show that it was actually safe, how the patients did. And there's so many problems that we looked at throughout this process of implementing these drugs that many of them we had a tech solution for. Just to name one example. So, the nurse calls the patient and let's say, okay, so you replace that with remote monitoring. So the patient reports. Okay. Patient reports during hours, the nurses get it. After hours, what happens? Oh, so now how does that report get to the doctor who's waiting on call? So you text the doctor. Oh, okay, so now it's PHI. So you need to develop a new way of secure texting physicians after hours. Well, let's develop, fail safes. What if that doctor isn't available? So she can't take the call, or she wasn't available, or she didn't see the text. Well, we need to fall back on another doctor. And so we're solving all of these problems to ensure that, honestly, after we've solved those, after we've worked through them, then the physicians actually feel more comfortable trying out and prescribing these new drugs, which are life-saving. And so to me, it's very rewarding. And I think over time, these things increase the value. So now we're seeing deals or partnerships with new practices that are entirely driven by their desire to receive support or to have better tooling and safety infrastructure to adopt these therapies.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we've experienced the same thing at DeepScribe where, you and I think we started the company around the same time. We've been working at this problem for nearly a decade at this point. And I think when you're working on a problem for that long, a lot of times it feels like you're in this dimly lit maze, bumping your head against the wall, trying to figure out how to get out of this. And, sometimes along that journey, you stumble upon these gems that, are only rewarded to you if you've spent this long thinking about one thing. And that ultimately turns into, the breakthrough that, leads to, a more robust product, a more comprehensive product, a product that frankly just works versus doesn't. And, I think we have kind of the same experience. It's interesting to kind of learn about, Canopy's journey in building out their apparatus, starting with kind of remote patient monitoring and now going into, very like program specific, protocols for specific types of therapy. I'm curious how you think about like the vision for Canopy. What are the different verticals? What are the different swim lanes in these verticals? What are the things that, you think Canopy can become beyond, what it is today?
Our mission, maybe let's start there. Canopy's mission is to ensure that every patient receives the best possible outcome from their treatment while having the best experience. So the mission doesn't change in the world of AI. I think AI does present a ton of opportunities for us and has changed how we view our roadmap and what we can do. But broadly speaking, if you want to operationalize this mission that we have, then, it involves making sure they're safe on therapy. It involves making sure they can start and get that therapy that would be best for them, even if it's novel and risky and toxic, but also involves their experience. And I think technology should and is playing a role with everything that happens outside the office, but it's a ton of point solutions that are disparate that make sense for the patient and for the office to be consolidated. And I think in each of them, you can imagine how AI can sort of reinvent it from the patient's perspective. So if you take an example of, a single patient's journey, so they need to schedule an appointment. So there's a system, right, for appointment reminders. Sometimes there's a separate system or form for scheduling or for intake of a new patient. And then they come in, they have their first treatment, they go home. They might get education on another system. They might get a reminder for their next appointment on a different system. E-Reg is a different system, right? All these things might sound administrative, but I could make a reasonable argument just that, if you just look at intake, for example, new patient gets a referral sent, practice gets a referral by fax 99% of the time.
We love our fax
right?
machines.
Well, we love our fax machines, right? So you get your referral by fax. Some human needs to, whether it's paper or it's fax to file, to folder, right? To PDF. Still, some person needs to look at these files, these faxes or papers, and sort them. Say, this is a referral. This is, an order or a lab result. Referrals go into a different pile. There's a different person whose role is to find them and manually sift through all the pages and create the draft as a medical record. Call the patient, verify the details, call the previous doctor, get the medical record. You get it. I won't burden you and whoever, the audience with all of these details, but it is painful. And it takes, weeks to schedule a first patient in community oncology, between 2 to 4 weeks, depending on the practice and how incredible they are. And I think technology can play a role and accelerate that. And not every patient will save their life or change their lives. And I'm not even talking about the experience. Everyone agrees that you don't want to stay at home anxious, knowing you have a cancer diagnosis and you haven't met your oncologist yet. But for some small percent of those patients, starting a week or two sooner will make a huge difference. And so I think if you think about Canopy and the future of technology for patient services, for care between visits, we're thinking of sort of one app or one place that a patient goes to and they have everything there. We're thinking of a world in which it goes from being super helpful for the patient, just consolidated in one place and looking great and working the way you would expect it in 2026, as opposed to, go to your computer, log into a portal, complicated login, you forget it, you have to have a computer. It's not on to go with you when you're at work or you're picking up the kids or whatnot, right? And you'd expect to be really good. Like, it's 2026, it's the world of ChatGPT and like AIs that can speak to you. Why do I need to read these complicated labs? Why can't I have some AI that says, for example, like describing the vision, so maybe step one is just one place where you could view all these things and have all of the communications you need for practice, whether it's messaging your practice, reporting your symptoms, getting appointment reminders. Step one. With step two would be reasonably, I think, hey, you have a new lab, everything looks in order, right? Or step three, or you have a new lab, there's an abnormality. Would you like me to message your nurse to discuss it? That feels very low hanging fruit, right? And maybe step 3 or 4 is, hey, your labs are back. One thing was irregular. Everything else looks great. I've already messaged your doctor. We'll address it in your upcoming visit. It doesn't, so it is as if you have your personal nurse working for you. I think that's the vision from the patient's perspective. From the practice perspective, staff are so overwhelmed by so many things. They have so many systems they're working with. I remember I was impressed when I started the company, when I first saw triage nurses and they started having 2 screens. I was impressed. And now sometimes you see folks working in a cancer practice and you have multiple screens, multiples. not just one or two.
It looks like
And they
quant
have all
traders
these,
like on the
yeah,
street, like
unreal. Like the way we share an office in New York, there are actually stockbrokers here and they have this whole setup. And some of the oncology practices I see are starting to look that way. And they are complaining, right? And they're saying the truth. They're saying this is complicated for us. Each person needs to learn how to use the practice management system, the EMR, and another one or two or 3 point solutions. And so I think for staff, it starts by automating the low-hanging fruit that we can through automation or AI. And then it continues with having a co-pilot for the staff. And it maybe continues by truly automating away a lot of the tedious things that they do so that they can be entirely devoted to patient care. And I think there are so many things that didn't need to have a person doing. So there's so many administrative workflows that happen, and accreditation workflows and data registries and various inputs. Busy schedulers who take more than 100 calls a day. And many of the patients could certainly just, for a simple follow-up or simple lab, blood draw, could just select from the next available time. One of the practices we work with recently shared with us that about 20% of the appointment reminders, the patients by mistake say no. Like, no, I can't, I don't
and they
confirm
cancel
the
the
appointment.
appointment.
And then they call them and they say, is everything okay? You said you can't make the
Yeah.
appointment. It's like, no, by mistake, we're sorry. So think of it, 20% of these calls that these schedulers make are completely avoidable and by mistake. So there's certainly so much room for improvement. And I think what we're seeing is that there's what you can't get to, and that's on the very top. So if you imagine a call center, it's those calls that take more than a few minutes of hold time and they get dropped. The patients give up and they hang up. And then if you fix those, what happens is you change everything that happens underneath. So all of those phone operators speaking to people or patient coordinators, or, every practice has a name for them. When they start seeing that their queue doesn't have a whole list of patients waiting for them and they're not feeling that stress, they take more time with each patient. Their voice changes, their stress levels drop. This is one of the jobs with the highest turnover rate in oncology practices. Maybe they will quit less. We've had nurses coming to us recently saying, hey, you know what? We had some legacy system and it didn't work great for us. And I was thinking about quitting my job. And since we've implemented Canopy, I've decided to stay. And that's huge. And if we could do that in different types of roles, if we can make their life, because man, we've been promising people, you, me, everyone in healthcare, in tech, that we're going to make their lives better. And I think it's been proven to be really hard, not just because of us, because of integrations, because the way EMRs work, because of meaningful use, because of different barriers and obstacles, right? And now with AI, we're able to come and drive huge impact. We're able to deliver on that in a big way for them. And I think, just lowering their burdens, making their days better, letting them not do all these tedious clicks and focus on patients.
One of the really interesting things that I've observed kind of firsthand, especially in oncology, is that I think we're in a really interesting time where I think the science is really outpacing the care that's delivered at the bedside. And if I think about, why that's the case, the answer that I come to is complexity, right? The root cause of waste and errors in day-to-day patient care comes down, in my opinion, to complexity. And what better way to solve complexity with the gift of AI that we've been kind of bespoke to, as somebody that has been working on technology for, over the past 15 years, like there are so many things that we can do today that were not even fathomable 10 years ago. And
100%.
I haven't really told this story before, but when we started the company, my co-founder was working at the Berkeley AI Research Lab, and he was leading the natural language processing group at Bayer.
NLP is a crazy thing. No one talks about NLP anymore.
Yeah, machine learning, right?
Yeah.
But what's really funny is I got to meet a lot of the other researchers at Bayer at the time, And one of them was working on a computer vision algorithm to identify whether or not a head of lettuce was ready to be harvested. And, you know, this was in 2017.
Such a difficult problem. I know.
It's a difficult problem, but in 2017, if you think about, farmers are using AI and computer vision in 2017 to identify whether or not a head of lettuce is going to be harvested. And you compare that to the technology adoption that we see in healthcare, right? You know, back then, you know, we were comparing our product to human scribes, right? And the technology adoption that you see in healthcare is, in my opinion, so slow, you know, obviously due to the reasons that you stated, but to me, it comes down to complexity, right? The complexity is the reason why you have all these fragmented systems. Complexity is the reason why you have all these different point solutions that are doing all these different things. And a lot of times it's kind of this negative feedback loop that we see where in order to solve complexity, you add
100%.
complexity. And
Yes.
I think, you know, the opportunity that we really have as kind of technology leaders in the community is to not make that same mistake again, right? I think, you know, what I've been observing in terms of working with our partners in the community is, you know, last year with the advent of AI, a lot of people were trying things, right? They were trying to use AI for very specific use cases throughout the entire stack, whether it's the front office, whether it's the pharmacy, whether it's the clinician, you know, you name it. Revenue cycle was a big one. And, you know, I'm talking to a lot of these technology leaders at, you know, at these practices. And, you know, I think a growing concern that I hear is that, you know, they're getting point solution fatigue, right? Like if you're trying to solve the complexity by adding more and more complexity, by managing multiple vendors, by managing and deploying, figuring out the change management for 100 different point solutions, you're ultimately going to end up with more complexity, right?
Yeah.
And I think the real opportunity that we have, just given how broad I think the remit of, you know, Canopy's vision and our vision is really to think about how can we fix the complexity by bringing a system together of solutions rather than just offering a point solution. And so I think, you know, Canopy has really interesting opportunities to kind of go beyond just patient services into all the other different kind of point functions across the patient facing kind of side of the aisle. And, you know, with us, you know, we're working with a lot of other companies building stuff ourselves to go not just at the point of care, but before the visit, after the visit, you know, lending kind of the intelligence and the data that we had from these conversations to other departments. And you can really start to imagine kind of this operating system or this modern operating system that, you know, becomes the new tech stack of the future.
Yeah, I'm a huge believer in your ability to do, you know, I think it's really like Ambient started with a note, but like, does the physician need to click through all these tedious buttons in the medical record? Or after the visit, can you tee up the orders for her? That she's already said, oh, we're going to do this. We're going to put you on that. I'm going to hydrate you. I'm going to order a lab, you know? So it just makes so much sense. Hey, what is that? What do you think is going to be the first EMR now that they changed the meaningful use criteria? Like you no longer have to have XYZ screens in the medical record system.
I have a lot of friends that are actually starting their own kind of tech-enabled healthcare practice today. And I'll be honest with you, most of them are building their own EMRs.
Yeah.
Right.
Like we saw with One Medical, right? They built from scratch.
One Medical, I think there was the first example of this, but now it's, you know, building an EHR, I think historically has been incredibly difficult, right? And I think it still is very, very difficult. But there's companies out there that are building kind of these headless EHRs that allow these operators to kind of build kind of basic functionality that's bespoke to their use case, that they're finding to be not only, you know, better for a lot of times they have a very niche use case where you kind of see the same thing in Ambient, where a lot of these EMRs have kind of built these horizontal applications that work for multiple specialties. But when you have a very bespoke use case, oncology is a great example. I think, you know, our friends at Ontada and Flatter have done an incredible job building kind of a, you know, specialty specific EMR. But yeah, I think, you know, the landscape is going to change. It's interesting. Yeah.
I think you're touching on something that's really interesting. I think we can all agree. And, you know, you name Onco EMR and iKnowMed as examples that oncology is different. And a lot of the platforms or systems or point solutions that we see working with hospital systems or derm or primary care offices or orthopedics or whatnot don't fit very well, don't work in the same way, don't fit in with the oncology tech stack, which is so inherently different than the Epic tech stack or the tech stack of any health system, whether it's Epic or Cerner or other, sort of enterprise grade health system EMRs that we see older generations of. I think that there's a great interview with Jensen from NVIDIA, and he basically said the future of AI in software is they're going to be in software, two types of companies and only two types of companies. He says there's going to be the ones who create foundational models. So, today would be like your Anthropic, your OpenAI, et cetera, Google, right? And then AI is going to do everything in between until you get to companies that are doing uber specialized use cases of AI, where not just implementation and last mile delivery make a huge difference, but, whether it's adaptation of the model, guardrails around the model, post-training, understanding, for example, when we answer the phone using AI, the AI, whether it's, we plug in Gemini, Claude, Sonnet or Opus or any other model, the LLM does, some of the work, but I'd say 90% of our work, maybe 99. What is the business logic? How do you verify that a patient is a patient? What happens when you have millions of patients and there are multiple people with the same name and the same date of birth? What happens if someone, how do you verify that patient? How do you identify their intent? What happens when every practice has different departments with different ticket types or message types, and patients say different words? And how do you make sure it arrives accurately and customized on a practice by practice level? I'd say the majority of it is business logic, and then followed by evals, like testing and evaluations to fit that business logic to make sure what needs to happen happens. And again, it's oncology. So someone calls in and says, I have chest pain. Maybe your derm's office says, tough luck, go to the ER, it's not on us. Like, we don't do that. But in oncology practice, any sort of symptom can be really bad. I can think of medical scenarios that, again, not a physician, but I can think of a scenario where confusion is fine. Like, you're getting chemo and you're confused, sort of brain fog. I can think of scenarios where confusion could be, multiple myeloma and confusion don't go well. It's, your calcium breaking up into your bloodstream. There are all kinds of things that a symptom could be either very naive or very bad. And that voice AI needs to be aware of that. And so anyway, I just think it creates opportunity for us and creates a world where I like innovating in.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I tell people all this all the time, right? The vision of DeepScribe is ultimately to build what we call the ambient operating system, right? And, we spent the past almost 9 years essentially building the Scribe, right? But the Scribe is really kind of the initial wedge where, not only are we able to be at the point of care and be a trusted partner in the care delivery process, but also we're at the point where we're, one step closer to the truth of what actually happened in the room. Rather than capturing just what happens, we capture why things have happened. And the question I ask myself is how can we leverage, that access to the point of care and also kind of this new level of insight that we have on how the care was being delivered to ultimately improve outcomes. So Lavi, one of the other things that I wanted to ask you was really, you've been running Canopy for almost nearly a decade. And, I think you're probably one of the experts on how do you think about change management and how do you drive kind of high levels of adoption in a specialty that's, really unique. I'm curious, can you share with the viewers, what is your strategy around change management? How do you think about it? And what has worked for you? What has not worked for you, over the past 8 to 9 years you've been building Canopy?
So there's two things. I think one is, you have to start with a willing partner, right? If the partner's not willing, you're not going to change anything. Good luck. And I think we should unpack that a little bit, because what does that mean and how do you get people to believe? And the second thing is, I think trust. Trust is the theme across all of this. It's sacred. And we can talk about some of the ways that Canopy builds trust or how we cherish the trust we have with our partners and the practices we work with, including life sciences companies that we work with. But let's start for a second on sort of the motivation. And irrespective of the motivation to adopt Canopy, whether it's for efficiency, operational efficiency, we don't want to drop calls, or we want to monitor our patients, we want to improve how we care for them between visits, or we want to adopt new therapies faster or better or safer way. There's a really interesting theme that I see often, which is in medicine, they are used to seeing these trials for things, right? And they're used to seeing this very high level of validation. And we've touched on that earlier. And I think sometimes, when there's a drug, it's a molecule, right? You run a trial reads positive or negative. Of course, there are nuances, how you analyze the study. Do you believe it? Do you think it's applicable? But on the whole, it works or it doesn't. I think what's different about what we do is it's not just does it work or does it, it's how you do it. It's how you implement it, and it's how the software, meaning you could have tried one AI for, to answer your phone, and it would absolutely suck. And a different AI would be incredible. But we've seen this. Sometimes, I call a great restaurant in New York and they have this AI bot to speak with. And I say, hey, are there 2 seats on the bar tonight? And it says, yeah. And I say, great. Can you make a reservation for me? And you call, an airline company, not to besmirch any specific one. And, you get this sort of NLP thing that you absolutely hate. And you have to go human, operator. And you get upset because you're just trying to get service, right? And you're stuck in some airport. Your flight's been pushed or delayed or canceled. And so I think it's like, if medicine, you could have a study that says a tools for digging, a randomized clinical trial, right? One group gets tools, one group doesn't get tools, and it says outcome tools were not helpful. Okay, what was the tool? What is a spoon? Was it a tractor? It's a huge difference, right? And so not all software systems were made the same. And also one person would know how to operate the tractor and would do it safely. Another person might not be trained appropriately, would not do it safely. And so that's the how you implement and how you do it carefully. And I think we've got it down. I would say, I would be remiss to say, not to a science, but we meticulously go and meet practices in person and map their workflows and see what they're like, and then map what they would be like after Canopy. And these are like really extensive charts. They're not like fun or easy to read because, there's a column for every system. And sometimes you have an action taken in one system, you go to another, you could shoot all the way to the other side and come back. There are a lot of different intersections. And when you see these, when you really document them, I think something really interesting happens. One is you go on site and you meet people, you look them in the eyes, you listen to them, you see what frustrates them. And sometimes what frustrates them is some systems are not built great or don't talk to one another and the workflow suffers. Sometimes what you see is the way the practice is set up in a very specific area or space or, role isn't as great as other practices have set it up because maybe other things have changed throughout the years. And you're able to take that sort of individual contributor level person, create visibility for their concerns or their issues with management, but also Canopy can measure with analytics what they're doing. And say you could show that nurses are doing a lot of administrative work in one practice over the other, and how you could direct that to more suitable staff members to solve those problems. So I think, when you really dive into the details, you find so much opportunity. You find so many clicks that don't need to take place. You find opportunities to workflow redesign even within the systems they're using, or, irrespective of Canopy, no Canopy. And you can show them how their workflow might stay the same apart from some things that are better. Also, again, the devil's in the details. So they could have 2 systems, but one of those systems is a little bit antiquated and they need to look in 5 different screens in that one system. So they're constantly stressed. Maybe something's going on in the other screen. What if I forget that 4th screen or that 5th screen? We see it commonly that people complain that they have messaging queues in various systems in the EHR, sometimes in multiple places in the EHR tasks and messages than in other systems. And when you look at the real detail of these things, sometimes one system, 5 screens It's better to add another system, have 3 systems and 3 screens. Does that make sense? Like, it's not about the number of systems or logos. It's about the quality of work of the staff member involved. And how do you solve for that? First of all, building trust by having greater understanding of what they're really doing and having an understanding of what it would look like after, showing it to them, delivering on that, making sure that you've delivered on that. One of the things that we've done a lot, I don't know if this resonates for you. I'm actually curious. When we build any sort of new feature or product, we usually know that it's not going to be as good in the first, say, 3 months. We know that everything that we ship in the first 3 months, we're going to have, it meets reality, and it's going to have to undergo a lot of changes until it starts to actually sort of flow and jive with the workflow and with real clinical practice. Have you seen that too?
Yeah, we see that all the time. I mean, I think you talk about trust, right? And I think the way that we think about trust is like, how do you bend the technology towards the workflow or towards the user rather than having the user bend themselves towards the technology? And in oncology specifically, what we learned is that there's a long tail problem, right? There's so many unique workflows. Like you said, you might find something that works in one specific practice, and then you go to another practice and it's completely different. And even though the problem's the same, the way you need to solve that problem is completely different. And so, we see that all the time. Of everything we release, we might get high signal that this is the best product since sliced bread, and then we go to another practice and we find out there's 50 other things that we need to build, and then go to the next practice. But I think that's part of the game in oncology. And what's important is, to your point, you need to find really good partners that will champion you along the way. And really be, patient. Like, we move really fast, but the people that we work with are extremely busy, and like the time and the feedback that we get from them is so valuable to us that, we need them to make that investment to help us make the product, bend the product towards the user.
But isn't that the best part of our jobs? Like, when you meet someone and they're thrilled.
The best part of the job is actually, when we implement DeepScribe, there's typically one or two physicians that, are so against, using an ambient scribe. One of our good friends, Leyland, was one of them. And him and I were good friends. He famously would tell me, Matt, like, I will never use DeepScribe. I put myself through medical school being a transcriptionist, and I'm a great typer, and, never going to use it. And, after I had him on the podcast, he promised that he'd use it. And he literally sent me the text the day he used it. He was like, I can't believe I haven't been using this for so long. But, the best feeling is not just getting the feedback from users that are champions. It's turning the detractors into champions. I think that's the really exciting part for me. Yeah.
Yeah, and you gotta love Texans. They'll always tell you how they feel to your face. And I actually like that approach. But it's kind of crazy. Like, often with my team, when we talk about AI and AI features that we want to roll out and safety considerations, the analogy to self-driving cars always comes up. Always. I don't know how, because it's the only space outside of our professional lives, outside of a computer, like in the physical space outside, that we run into physical AI and with hardware all the time. Especially living in SF, like Waymos are everywhere. And Waymo started with basically humans monitoring every Waymo, because often they would get stuck. Prioritizing safety, they would get stuck. And what we've seen with AI recently, like in the past 2 years, the improvement trajectory of those Waymos have gone like just vertical. They don't need humans, rarely if ever. And they're just autonomous, and they feel so safe.
I think it's a great analogy, and I actually used it with my conversation with Ravi Parikh. I used it because Waymo had just released their kind of safety report, and they showed that, I think it was like, for every 1,000,000 miles there was
massive reduction.
There was 0.0, I think, 2 like serious injury related events per 1,000,000 miles, and then if you compare that to a human driver, it was 0.22. So it was, I think, like literally an order of magnitude safer for a self-driving car.
I just Googled, it's a 92% reduction in fatal accidents. 92%.
And so if you think about that in medicine, right? It's like, if we had something like that, that showed that this drug or this way to treat a patient is literally an order of magnitude better, you would expect for that to make it its way into the guidelines, and that would be part of the standard of care, right?
Yeah.
But you look at Waymos, right? In San Francisco, they're everywhere, and frankly, I think the Waymos are safer than the human drivers, especially all the Uber drivers out there. And it's kind of like the way I think about it. It was like, at what point do we actually mandate self-driving cars, right? Like, at what point are Uber drivers not allowed to drive
But
cars
let's
anymore?
let's unpack it. Like, there are insurance companies that are already saying that. I mean, Lemonade CEO, Lemonade, for anyone who doesn't know, is a sort of a tech first insurance company. I insure my home through Lemonade, so it's a few clicks. And their whole go to market their whole idea was, we're not going to have a ton of paperwork and forms for you to ever make a claim that you got, your house got robbed or you had a fire. We're not going to burden you with so much paperwork that you could never get paid. But as a result, as a company, we're going to save so much money on administrative burden that we're going to be profitable. And now with AI, they've taken off. And so they've decided to apply what worked for them outward. And they're saying, I think their CEO reached out to Elon Musk recently and said, hey, I'm willing to, for people who use FSD, I'm willing to lower their Tesla insurance rate because I know that they're going to have less accidents. I think it's not a hot take to say that in 10 years or 15 years, it will be far more expensive to insure your car if you say you're going to be driving it. And I think if you apply that to medicine, by extension, I think in 5-10 years, these sort of, let's say, ambient scribes today, later ambient operating systems, later they also nudge the doctor like, hey, what you did here, there might be, that might be not just off label, but might not be, might be off compendia, might not be suitable. There might be a better option. NCCN might recommend something different, or maybe be great if you ran this test. It's inevitable that this is going to happen. And I think not in an annoying way like EMRs tried implementing it, back in the day, which was a lot of pop-ups and buttons and are you sure's and confirm and yes and checkboxes. I think just something more like, today physicians go for every patient almost. I think young physicians our age, right? My friends tell me they go to Open Evidence or they go to, their favorite AI, Insert AI, right? And sometimes they have 2 or 3 and they cross-reference them. And isn't it obvious that in a few years, a company like DeepScribe could go in, prep the note, prep the chart before the visit, go into Open Evidence or some other AI, or use AI to just check NCCN and all the latest guidelines and evidence and say, hey, before the doctors even enter the room, it's like another physician has done an entire workup. And so if you believe in that future, I think it's also inevitable that this will lower their malpractice insurance when they are compliant with it to some rate, just like, utilization management that payers do. It's inevitable. They're doing that with AI now. And so I don't know. Do you think that's a hot take? I think it's inevitable.
I don't think it's a hot take. I think the hot take is really what time horizon, right? Because, to your point, right, like, a lot of these innovations in healthcare take 10, 15 years to adopt, right? And I started this company from the patient's lens, right? My mom had breast cancer. I saw how difficult it was to traverse the healthcare apparatus, if you will. If something exists that improves outcomes, that improves patient experience, I think that there should be a huge amount of urgency to turn that into the standard of care. Obviously, through the right evaluations, do it in a safe and responsible way. But if things take 10, 15 years to get to the bedside, the only person that's losing in that situation is the patients, right? And so I think we have a moral obligation to get that, to the patient sooner.
Well, look, there's some use cases of AI. You might argue that you need FDA approval, and the FDA doesn't even know how to wrap its head around it yet. And I think they're struggling with that, and for good reason. But set that aside for a second. I think a lot of things take time. Even self-driving cars, right? Self-driving cars, I think it's actually a great analogy to push back on you here for a second, okay? look how many years since the first Waymo came out until where I would say in some cities, Austin, San Francisco, broad adoption, right? And I would argue that actually the technology wasn't good enough back then. And once you do something and you get to a point that is game changing, and also we can see it with our companies, like, I don't think Canopy had the perfect market fit, what we call in tech product market fit. I don't think it was good enough to sell like crazy 4 or 5 years ago, but we are good enough to sell a lot faster into more practices today. And certainly we have sort of, 10% of the market right now. And when you look at DeepScribe, also you had sort of a moment that you hit a pivotal point, right? Where technology got so good that you exploded in your partnerships. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is that just like for DeepScribe, just like for Tesla FSD, there comes a point where the technology is 10x better, 10x faster, 10x cheaper, 10x more, maybe safe. In the example of Waymo, it's literally, 90% safer. Then that becomes the driver to adoption. And I think right now we're so in the early innings of this that I also think there's a lot of responsibility for us. Like it's incumbent on us to produce things that are really that 10 or 100x better and then show it. And I think when it does hit, these folks, I would say like in community oncology and in oncology, have been so generous with us and so, sort of generous with their time and their referrals and their recommendations and their, relationships with other physicians and other CEOs of cancer centers. And, I've come to learn, agree or disagree, we spend so little on marketing, but even still, our marketing expense is really small in the company. It's not even 10, it's about 5 to 10% of the budget. And when you look at that, I think our number one marketing tool is when we partner with practices and they love it and they rage about it. Like you say, your detractors turned into supporters. When you have those people, that's your best ever marketing. And so I spend majority of my time, I think, outside of building a team or not, in ensuring that the whole company is going in that direction of sticking with our customers in the trenches, sticking with new products that we roll out and really ensuring they're seeing the benefit and that they're very happy and turning each one of them into an advocate, I guess, by just being successful, right? I think those success stories are the most important thing. Like it's the most rewarding thing. It's the most, I think, commercially rewarding thing. Like it's the best thing for our companies. Then marketing, I think marketing, when they do a really great job, it's just sort of like, it's the topping. A lot of marketing is figuring out what's your target audience and what are you selling them and what does it do for them? And does it really do something for them? Does it do it well? And once all those things are put together, then marketing comes over at the very end and puts a bow on the top of it and hands it, whether it's a webinar or the, podcast or anything, but eventually you're marketing your success and you need to have success to market. That's my opinion. Josh on our team says he learned at Northwestern, I think, nothing destroys a bad product faster than good marketing. And I think it's true.
I totally agree. I mean, I think we have an obligation to not only our partners, but to patients to make sure that we remind ourselves that we're working in service of them. And, to be clear, like when I say, hey, like we should think about how do we accelerate making specific technologies the standard of care in medicine based off of data that demonstrates their efficacy, demonstrates that they're good enough, we need to find a way to come together as a community, not just in oncology, but as a society in general, to figure out how can we get those, that technology to the bedside. And so, yeah, I think marketing a bad product is going to, not make the product any better. And if anything, it's probably going to, make some empty promises that you're not going to be able to keep, and that's going to lead to your demise. But yeah, I mean, look, I don't think any of us are doing that. I think for us, it's just like, okay, we know we have a good product. We have data to show that it's not only saving people time, it's also really helping the patient experience, helping the providers satisfaction throughout their day. The question really is like, okay, now we can go beyond that, but also what can we be doing to kind of think about making these tools part of the standard of care? Um, I think right now, technologies like ours, they're not viewed as drugs, right? And therefore, they're still kind of like these discretionary tools that people can choose to adopt. But when you have, data that shows that, these tools should be part of the standard of care, I think there should be a process to kind of make them the standard of care.
The fact that most AI scribe tools have 10% adoption and some have 80% or more, like DeepScribe, the proof is right there. All those people are not using it because you have such a fun app to use and it gives you tactile feedback like an old school, iPod. They use it because it provides value in their days, right? Because it saves them time, because they can look their patient in the eyes, because they enjoy it, because they don't like charting late into the night. And so I think adoption, it's kind of funny, like early on, the first thing that we published on was in remote monitoring is that patients actually adopted because people thought that patients would not use it, that they wouldn't want to use it. And sometimes they thought that holding contradictory opinions, like both my patients are, I have lots of patients with low literacy rates and, low social economic status and a lot of diversity, and they wouldn't use an app. And then the same physician sometimes said, but my patients are going to report every toenail itch and they're going to drive me crazy. And I think we had insane, like in the very first version of Canopy, we published on it also in the Journal of Oncology Practice. It's like 82% adoption and 88% retention 6 months in. And the reason was patients, like it was the most primitive mechanism that existed. Patients put in a symptom, and if it was bad, they got a call from a nurse within a few minutes. Magic moment, like trust building moment. You have an app that you say you're in pain and your practice calls you right away to help you. And that's like a miracle. And so I think the same reason that we got adoption then is the same reason you're getting adoption now, because you've cracked something that works. I guess it's incumbent on us to like figure out more and more of these and grow and offer more value. And I like doing it.
Yeah. Lavi, I'm curious, like, ePros have been around for a long time, right? And I think they were kind of all the rage maybe 5-6 years ago, and they kind of went cold, and then now they're hot again, right? I'm kind of curious, like, what do you think was wrong with how we were thinking about ePros before, and like, what do you think Canopy is doing different that changes that?
I think in every product that we build, an ePro, a way to monitor patients is one of them, right? Electronic patient report outcomes is one of the products. And just like any other product that we build, we look through the process and we look at the challenges. And there were a lot of challenges. Starting from when I started the company, a very famous physician told me, listen, kiddo, like we give patients these surveys and they don't want to fill them out. And doctors don't care to read them. And I believe like you, it's going to improve care. But I looked and they were giving patients these like 20 to 30-minute surveys that had every symptom in a separate screen. And you had to answer for 70 symptoms. How bad is your pain? How bad is your diarrhea? How bad is can you imagine sitting with an iPad in hand, which is better than a piece of paper still, but going through each of these for 70 questions and then answering a host of other questions, it's miserable. And doing that every week or every visit, basically. And so I think, again, like with the analogy in the spoon and the tractor, doing that versus doing a really quick, hey, how are you feeling? Do you have any symptoms? And if you do, you tell it what, and that takes 2 minutes. And then you also get value back. There's a huge difference. So that's just the first challenge we solved was how do you structure the survey for the patients to engage?
So it's really like a design challenge, really. Like they were just kind of taking the book and throwing it at the patient versus not really thinking and having taste in terms of how to build and design product?
I would phrase it more, more generously. And I would say they were using these very sort of legacy, but what was the industry standard and still is for validated questionnaires and instruments that were primarily used in clinical trials. And you're definitely anchoring there on accuracy. And usually it was done, in a clinical trial with a patient who's super motivated to do it and a nurse sitting by them and helping them fill it out. And then they expected that thing to scale. I would argue today, even in clinical trials, we should be using more patient-friendly tools. But there's just one challenge, right? After that, how do you get it in the patient's hands? So an iPad in a clinic, it doesn't offer the main value, which is to detect symptoms between visits, right? So you're at the visit, you already have your symptoms will have been detected. You're about to meet your physician, right? And so when you enable them to do it conveniently at home, right? And you think about enrollment, do you have to sit with every patient? Let's say you already have an app, sit with every patient as opposed to integrate the EMR in a very discrete level and detect every administration of every drug, reach out to the patient the appropriate timing. So all of these challenges across the process that you just have to put in the effort to map and solve for, I think that makes the difference.
So Lavi, I know we're almost out of time, and I have a question that I like to ask every single one of my guests. And that is, if there's one thing that you wished oncologists knew about technology, what would it be? And if there's one thing that you wish other technologists would know about oncology and oncologists, what would it be?
I think, okay, so what I wish physicians would know about technology, I would just go with what we already touched on, which is not all technology is made the same. And even the same technology improves throughout time. So if you've seen something, even if you're skeptical, give it a try, see what actual results it produces. And even if the results aren't good, go back and revisit it. Going back to the Tesla example, just, a day and night, what it was 2-3 years ago and what it is today. For what I wish people knew about oncology is, it's often I would get like VCs, venture capitalists sending, young entrepreneurs or people who are like earlier in the journey coming to me and be like, oh, hey, like, here's a problem. I'll give you an example. A very frequent theme is clinical trials. Clinical trials, only 1% or, low one single digit of patients participate in clinical trials in oncology. There are so many trials. Pharma's willing to pay a lot of money to recruit patients. And clearly, we can easily look at the medical record with AI and solve this problem. Eureka. And I think it's such a great example because it's complicated, right? You remember you spoke about complexity in the system. Not all complexity is even regulation tech. When you think about that clinical trial, there's a lot that, for good reason, it's so hard to enroll patients in trials. And there's a lot of nuance in it. The drugs that are really, really, really great are going to enroll like crazy. And the drugs where the investigator might have the inkling that it's not working so well, you're going to really struggle enrolling patients. And then you look at those drugs on rare indications that are going to struggle with enrollment. The problem is, even if you find a patient, the patient might not be anywhere near a site. And even if you find a patient and fly the patient and have the budget to do that, patient might not want to go to the trial, or physician of patient might not recommend the trial, or they might have just started on a different drug. And so all these problems, you have to really, if I basically surmise it, you have to really be passionate about this and about helping people and about working with clinicians in the trenches, because you're going to spend a decade solving a good problem in oncology. And if you will, it will have been a really worthwhile problem to solve. And again, I think in the DNA of Canopy, people show up to work and they are stoked to work on these things and help. And that better be the DNA of the company you're starting or of the technology, because I don't think oncology is a get rich quick, sort of area in tech.
All right, Lavi. Well, I really enjoyed the conversation today, and appreciate your time, and thanks for coming on.
Awesome. This has been great. Thanks for having me, man.